Vacant Hearts, The Ballad of Sid and Nancy. Chapter 2. Trajectory. Nancy, New York City, spring 1975. The Chelsea Hotel loomed over 23rd Street like a Gothic fortress, a sanctuary for artistic outcasts and beautiful disasters. Nancy Spungen stood across the street, tilting her head back to take in the ornate Victorian facade. Her hands trembled slightly, partly from excitement, partly from the beginning of withdrawal. She'd been in New York for 3 months, but this pilgrimage to the Chelsea had taken on mythic importance in her mind. "Are you coming in or what?" Jerry, her current dealer and occasional fuck, looked impatient. He was meeting someone in the lobby, some musician Nancy had pretended to recognize when Jerry mentioned the name. The lobby hit her like a narcotic itself, red carpet worn thin by decades of dreamers, wrought iron staircases spiraling upward, artwork covering every available surface. Nancy felt an immediate sense of belonging that was almost painful in its intensity. This was what she'd been searching for since escaping Pennsylvania, this nexus of creativity and decay. She watched Jerry talk to his contact, a skinny man with tangled hair and track marks visible on his arms. Nancy hung back, studying the other residents moving through the lobby, a woman in a flowing vintage dress, an aging poet muttering to himself, a young painter with pigment still staining his fingers. "Hey!" Jerry was suddenly beside her again. "I'm going up to make a deal. You coming?" Nancy nodded, following him into the ancient elevator operated by a man who looked as old as the hotel itself. They rode to the 7th floor in silence. The room belonged to someone named D.D., who greeted them with manic energy and fast, slurred speech. The place was a chaotic shrine to rock and roll, with records scattered across every surface and band posters covering water-stained walls. "Who's the chick?" D.D. asked, looking Nancy up and down with bloodshot eyes. "Nancy," she answered before Jerry could. "I'm a manager. For bands." The lie came easily. In the brief time she'd been in New York, Nancy had learned that identity was fluid here. You could become whoever you claimed to be, at least for a while. Dee laughed. "Yeah? What bands?" "I'm between clients right now." Nancy kept her voice cool, disinterested. "Just got done working with the New York Dolls." "Bullshit," Dee said, but he was smiling, amused rather than angry at the obvious lie. Nancy shrugged, affecting boredom while surveying the room. There were several other people present, a couple making out on a worn couch, a girl nodding off in the corner, 2 guys arguing about someone named Johnny Thunders. Jerry and Dee retreated to a corner to conduct their business. Nancy wandered to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city had swallowed her whole, just as she'd wanted. After fleeing Pennsylvania, she'd survived by moving between crash pads and temporary rentals, financed through a combination of sex work, small-time drug dealing, and money wired by her guilt-ridden parents. Her days blurred together in a haze of quaaludes, heroin, and alcohol, punctuated by nights at Max's Kansas City and CBGB. Nancy had a talent for inserting herself into scenes, for making people remember her, usually for her volatility and sharp tongue. She'd sleep with musicians, steal from friends, burn bridges, and somehow still find new people willing to take her in. "You want a hit?" Dee was suddenly beside her, offering a needle with practiced casualness. Nancy's veins ached in anticipation. "What is it?" "China White. Best shit in the city right now." She followed him to the bathroom, watching as he prepared 2 syringes. Nancy had graduated from pills to heroin within weeks of arriving in New York. The first time, she'd been terrified of the needle. Now, she extended her arm without hesitation, exposing track marks still fresh enough to be read rather than scarred over. The rush hit her like a collapsing building, warm, then hot, then obliterating. She slid down against the bathroom wall, vaguely aware that Dee was saying something about a band called the Ramones, about CBGB, about the scene changing. "London," she heard him say. That's where it's really happening now. You should see these kids from England, man. They make us look like fucking hippies. Nancy's head lolled back against the cool tile. London. The word circulated through her heroin-clouded mind like a promise. London, where rock stars came from, where the real action was. Take me with you, she murmured, not knowing if she was speaking to Dee Dee or to some phantom of her imagination. Take me to London. Hours later, she emerged from the Chelsea hotel alone, Jerry having disappeared with one of the girls from the room. Night had fallen, and 23rd Street was alive with the energy of people pursuing various forms of oblivion. Nancy stood on the sidewalk, momentarily disoriented. The heroin was wearing off, leaving her in that terrible grey space between highs. A man approached her, well-dressed, middle-aged, obviously slumming. "Looking for company?" he asked, eyes tracking over her thin frame in the short leather skirt. Nancy named a price higher than usual. He didn't blink, just gestured toward his car parked nearby. As she followed him, Nancy glanced back at the Chelsea. One day, she promised herself, she'd live there. One day, she'd be something more than Nancy Spungen from Huntington Valley. She'd be someone who mattered. Sid, London, fall, 1975. "Fucking stand still, Simon!" Vivian Westwood yanked at the torn t-shirt she was pinning on John's wiry frame. The sex shop buzzed with activity around them, customers browsing rubber clothing and bondage gear, Malcolm McLaren holding court near the register, shop assistants moving between racks of deliberately offensive designs. "It's Sid now," he corrected her for the third time that week. John Simon Ritchie had officially died somewhere in the squats and alleyways of London. Sid Vicious, named after Johnny Rotten's hamster, of all the fucking ridiculous things, had risen in his place. Vivian ignored him, placing another safety pin through the fabric. "Arms up." Sid complied, wincing as one of the pins scraped his skin. He was modelling for Vivian's new designs, if modelling was the right word for standing still while she attacked him with scissors and pins, transforming ordinary clothing into confrontational statements. "Malcolm wants to see you when we're done," Vivian said, her voice muffled around pins held between her lips. "Something about a band." Sid's heart quickened, though he kept his face carefully blank. For months he'd been orbiting the edges of what Malcolm had started calling the Sex Pistols, a band built from scratch with his mate Johnny Rotten as the frontman. Sid had been to their rehearsals, watched them fumble through covers and nascent original songs, the chaos as much a part of the performance as the music itself. "There," Vivian stepped back to survey her work. "Go look." Sid moved to the mirror, taking in his transformation. The t-shirt had been slashed and reconstructed with safety pins, crude stitching, and provocative text. Combined with his torn jeans, steel-toed boots, and the spiky black hair Vivian had cut for him last week, the effect was one of calculated, confrontational disorder. "It's all right," he said, which from Sid was high praise. Across the shop, Malcolm waved him over. At 30, McLaren was substantially older than the kids he surrounded himself with, but his energy matched theirs, frenetic, subversive, and relentlessly ambitious. Beside him stood Johnny Rotten, his red hair sticking up in uneven spikes, a sneer seemingly permanently affixed to his face. "Sid!" Malcolm clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Just the man. Tell him, Johnny." Johnny looked Sid up and down with those strange, bulging eyes that gave him an air of perpetual intensity. "Glenn's being a cunt about rehearsals. Says he can't make the next few." Glenn Matlock was the Sex Pistols bass player, musically competent but too buttoned up for the brand of chaos Malcolm wished to unleash on the music landscape. "So?" Sid asked, not following. "So," Malcolm interjected, "we need someone to fill in. Johnny here thinks you might be the man for the job." Sid blinked, momentarily lost for words. He'd been playing around with a bass that someone had left at a squat, but could barely manage the simplest of lines. "I can't really play," he admitted. Johnny laughed, a harsh sound without genuine humour. "None of us can really play, you stupid git. That's not the fucking point." Malcolm nodded sagely. The Pistols aren't about musicianship. They're about attitude, energy, disruption. He leaned in closer. The look is half the battle, and you've got that sorted. Sid felt a surge of something like purpose, a novel sensation after years of drifting. When's the next rehearsal? Tomorrow, 2:00, that abandoned warehouse off Portobello Road. Johnny handed him a crumpled piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. Don't be late and try to be at least partially sober. After they left the shop, Sid wandered through Soho, the weight of opportunity pressing on him like a physical presence. The streets were getting darker earlier as autumn deepened, and a cold drizzle had begun to fall. He pulled up the collar of his leather jacket, a prize stolen from a pub coat check months ago. London in 1975 was dying in slow motion. The economic crisis had deepened, unemployment soaring while inflation rendered money almost meaningless for people like Sid. The promise of the 60s had curdled into something bitter and desperate. It was the perfect breeding ground for the movement that was beginning to coalesce around Malcolm's shop and bands like the Sex Pistols, punk, though the term was still finding its footing. Sid stopped at a pub off Oxford Street, where he knew the barman would serve him without asking for ID. He had exactly enough change for 1 pint, which he nursed while watching the after-work crowd. Office workers loosening ties, couples meeting for dates, normal people living normal lives that seemed as alien to Sid as life on another planet. A girl slid onto the stool next to him, heavily made up, dark hair cropped short. "Buy a girl a drink?" she asked, already reaching for his glass. Sid recognized her from the scene around the sex shop, one of the growing tribe of girls who dressed like Vivienne's models and followed bands from venue to venue. "Can't," he replied. "Skint." She took a sip of his beer anyway. "Aren't you friends with Johnny Rotten, from the Pistols?" The question sent a small thrill through him. Being adjacent to Johnny had already given Sid a certain cachet in their small circle. What would happen when he actually joined them on stage? "Yeah," he said, allowing himself a rare smile. "Actually, I'm joining the band, temporarily." The girl's eyes widened. "No shit? What do you play?" "Bass," Sid said, growing more confident in the lie. "Johnny asked me himself." The night unfolded from there. The girl, whose name was Susie, bought him drinks after he promised to get her into the next Pistols gig. They ended up at a party in a derelict building near Ladbroke Grove, where someone had tapped into the electrical grid to power turntables and amplifiers. The place was packed with London's emerging punk scene, art school dropouts, working-class kids with no prospects, middle-class rebels slumming it. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, cheap hash, and the sweat of bodies moving to the raw sounds of Iggy and the Stooges blasting from blown speakers. Sid lost track of Susie, but found himself in a corner with a group passing around a bottle of vodka and a packet of pills. He took both without asking what the pills were. In his experience, it was better not to know, better just to feel whatever came next. What came next was a surge of energy that had him in the centre of the makeshift dance floor, thrashing with abandon as the music shifted to something faster, more aggressive. Bodies collided around him, the dancing closer to fighting than any traditional movement. Sid's elbow connected with someone's face. He felt a warm spray of blood, but kept moving, kept pulsing with the furious rhythm. Later, minutes or hours, he couldn't tell, he found himself on the roof, the cold air a shock after the heat of the party below. London sprawled before him, a sea of lights punctuated by dark patches where power cuts had left whole blocks in shadow. Beside him, a boy with a half-shaved head passed him a joint. "Heard you're joining the Pistols," he said. News travelled fast in their small world. "Yeah," Sid confirmed, taking a deep drag. "They're going to change everything," the boy said with the absolute conviction of youth and chemicals. "Tear it all down." Sid nodded, watching the smoke from the joint disappear into the night air. "That's the plan." He meant it as a joke. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he felt their truth. That was exactly what Johnny and Malcolm intended: to tear down the edifice of rock music, to shatter the complacency of British society, and now Sid was going to be part of it. The drugs, the cold, and the vertiginous height of the roof combined to create a moment of perfect clarity, rare for Sid, who typically moved through life in a fog of confused anger. For perhaps the first time, he could see a path forward, something more than just surviving from one day to the next. He had no way of knowing that across the Atlantic, a blonde girl with a talent for chaos was already planning her invasion of his world, that their paths were set on a collision course that would end in blood and headlines. In that moment, Sid Vicious was simply alive in a way he had never been before, poised on the edge of becoming. Nancy, Philadelphia to New York, winter 1975. Nancy, please come downstairs. Her mother's voice drifted up to her childhood bedroom, where Nancy sat on the edge of her old bed, feeling like a stranger in a space that had once been hers. Coming back to Huntington Valley had been a mistake. She'd known it even as she boarded the bus from New York, shivering in withdrawal, her few possessions stuffed into a ratty backpack. 3 days later, the feeling had only intensified. Her parents walked on eggshells around her, her siblings avoided her, and the suburban quiet made her skin crawl after months in the constant noise of New York. "I'm coming!" she shouted back, popping a Valium she'd found in her mother's bathroom cabinet. It wouldn't touch her opioid withdrawal, but it might take the edge off enough to get through dinner. Downstairs, the Spungen family tableau was arranged with painful care. Father Frank at the head of the table, Mother Deborah bringing serving dishes from the kitchen, siblings Susan and David sitting with textbooks hastily pushed aside. Nancy slid into her old seat, acutely aware of how she disrupted the careful rhythm they'd established in her absence. "I made your favourite," Deborah said, setting a casserole dish on the table. "Tuna noodle." Nancy stared at the food, her stomach turning. "I don't eat that anymore." "Oh." Her mother's face fell. "When did that change?" "When I realised it's disgusting," Nancy said, knowing she was being needlessly cruel but unable to stop herself. The withdrawal made everything sharper, more irritating. Frank cleared his throat. "Nancy, your mother spent all afternoon cooking this." "So, I didn't ask her to." Susan, 14 and increasingly resembling the studious, well-adjusted daughter Nancy had never been, looked up from her plate. "Why do you always have to ruin everything?" "Fuck you," Nancy snapped. "Nancy!" Deborah's voice rose. "Language!" "Oh my God," Nancy pushed back from the table. "I'm not 12 anymore, Mum. I'll say whatever the fuck I want." David, the youngest at 12, stared at his plate, shoulders hunched as if trying to physically remove himself from the conflict. Frank stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough. Nancy, either you speak respectfully in this house, or you can leave the table." Nancy laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humour. "Leave the table? Why don't I just leave, period? Isn't that what you all want, for the family freak to disappear again?" "That's not fair," Deborah said, tears forming in her eyes. "We want you here. We want to help you." "Help me?" Nancy's voice rose. "If you wanted to help me, you wouldn't have had me locked up in that fucking mental hospital when I was 15. You wouldn't have made me feel like some kind of monster my whole life." The familiar argument unspooled like a worn tape. Nancy's grievances, her parents' defences, the hurt layered upon hurt that had formed the foundation of their relationship for years. By the time dinner was officially abandoned, Nancy was shaking with rage and withdrawal, her family retreating to separate corners of the house to lick their wounds. In her room, Nancy frantically searched for something to take the edge off. Finding nothing but the single Valium she'd already taken, she began tearing through drawers and boxes, looking for cash, jewellery, anything she could sell or trade once she got back to the city. Her hands closed around an old jewellery box, sterling silver, a gift from her grandmother. Nancy stuffed it into her bag, along with a pair of earrings from her dresser and $40 she found in an envelope in her desk drawer. She was climbing out the window, leg already slung over the sill, when her bedroom door opened. Deborah stood there, a plate of food in her hands, her face tight with the effort of trying again. For a moment, mother and daughter stared at each other across the room, Nancy halfway out the window, Deborah frozen in the doorway, both caught in a tableau that perfectly captured their relationship. "I brought you some," Deborah began, then registered what she was seeing. "Nancy, what are you doing?" Nancy could have lied, could have claimed she was just getting air. Instead, she swung her other leg over the sill. "Leaving. Don't worry, I won't be back this time." The plate clattered to the floor, tuna casserole splattering across the carpet. "Nancy, please, you're not well. Let us help you." "I don't need your kind of help," Nancy said, already descending onto the porch roof. "I need to get back to New York." "You'll die out there," Deborah's voice cracked. "Is that what you want? To die in some filthy apartment with people who don't care about you?" Nancy paused, looking back at her mother's tear-streaked face. For a brief moment, something like doubt flickered across her features. Then she steeled herself. "At least I'll die living my own life, not the one you wanted for me." With that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving her mother calling her name from the window. The sound followed Nancy down the street, growing fainter with each step until it was swallowed by the quiet suburban night. 6 hours later, Nancy was back in New York, having hitched rides from a series of increasingly sketchy drivers. She sold the jewelry box and earrings to a pawn shop in the East Village, using part of the money for drugs and the rest for a week's rent on a room in a decaying brownstone occupied primarily by junkies and sex workers. The apartment was barely more than a closet, a mattress on the floor, a hot plate balanced precariously on a milk crate, a bathroom shared with the entire floor. But to Nancy, it was freedom. She lay on the stained mattress, the heroin warming her veins, and stared at the ceiling where water stains formed abstract patterns. Her thoughts drifted to CBGB, where she'd been spending most of her nights before her ill-fated trip home. The club had become the epicenter of a scene that was still defining itself, not quite punk yet, but moving in that direction. Nancy had slept with half the musicians who played there, ingratiated herself with the bartenders, made herself a fixture in the shifting social landscape. But increasingly, the stories filtering in from London captivated her imagination. English bands with outrageous names and even more outrageous behaviour. A scene that made New York's cutting edge look almost quaint by comparison. Nancy's gaze fell on a copy of Rock Scene magazine she'd stolen from a newsstand. The cover featured a British musician, one of the established rock stars, not the emerging punks. But the article inside mentioned this new London scene in passing. Nancy had read those paragraphs over and over, fixating on descriptions of King's Road shops and Soho clubs. When the heroin released its grip enough for her to move, Nancy reached for the magazine, flipping to the dog-eared page. "London's Angry Youth Movement," the caption read beneath a photo of kids with spiky hair and torn clothing. "That's where I need to be," Nancy murmured to the empty room. It wasn't just the scene that drew her, it was the distance. Far from Pennsylvania, far even from New York, where she was already burning bridges as quickly as she built them. London represented a clean slate, a place where she could reinvent herself completely. Nancy closed her eyes, fantasizing about English boys with strange accents and stranger clothes, about being exotic and interesting as an American girl in London, about finding something that might finally fill the void that drugs only temporarily plugged. For now, though, New York would have to do. Tomorrow, she'd go back to CBGB, ask around about bands touring England, start laying the groundwork for her eventual escape across the Atlantic. Nancy Spungen was nothing if not determined when she set her sights on something. As she drifted off into a heroin haze, Nancy's last conscious thought was a promise to herself. One way or another, she would get to London. And when she did, she would find a way to make everyone remember her name.